My name is Robert Tremblay. I'm the Associate Director of Admissions here at the school, as well as a 2010 graduate. And so today what we're going to be doing is our final installment of the series we have been doing on the physiology of taste. And so through this series, we've been examining really the 5 tastes that humans experience when they're eating food. Thus far, over the first 4 weeks, we've gone through salty, we've gone through sugar, we've gone through sour, and we've gone through bitter. And now for the final installment, we're going to be focusing on one of the more conspicuous tastes of them all, and that's going to be umami. So umami, in its simplest definition, is really the lasting, lingering flavor that food leaves on your palate, or really a savory sensation. That's kind of the simplest definition. But when we look a little bit deeper at the actual taste of umami, it kind of goes back a little bit more in its history. It was actually the last taste that was discovered out of the 5, and it was actually discovered by a Japanese chemist back in 1908. And what he discovered was really the way that humans interact with an enzyme called glutamate. And so glutamate is really a neurotransmitter in terms of the way that we interpret food. It generates excitement in your brain. It really generates a connection to food that makes you want to eat more and more of it. So that's why when we talk about umami, we're talking about a soothing, a savory experience with food, and also a generation of excitement. When we talk biologically about humans interacting with food, we are actually hardwired to enjoy protein. And that's essentially what glutamate is. It's the sensation of eating protein. So when we think about it from that biological standpoint, utilizing proteins, vegetables, soups and things of that nature, and other ingredients that really reenact that type of flavor on the palate is really approachable for humans and really makes it that much more desirable to eat. So out of the 5 tastes, it might be the most conspicuous of them all, but at the same time, it's really one of the most important because it ties all the other 4 tastes together in one fell swoop. So when we talk about umami and the things that it happens in things naturally, and a lot of different vegetables, a lot of naturally in proteins like, cow meat, any type of animal protein really is going to generate that type of glutamate and things. We also find it naturally in things like mushrooms. We find them in fermented elements of that nature. So any type of fermented foods like soy sauce or ketchup in some instances will have a lot of umami to it. It's really about those elements of that meaty flavor, that savory element on the palate. One area that's important to know when we talk about umami is really the way that it comes to us in its most abundant form, and that comes through processed foods. And the reason for that is the use of a very common thing that we hear all the time, and that's MSG, which is monosodium glutamate. So it's essentially an artificial salt that has glutamate already worked into it, and it's really a flavor enhancer, and it really allows, sometimes chefs will use it. It's really it's not used commonly in the industry, but it's more commonly found in those processed foods. So MSG and high amounts of glutamate in your food can sometimes have adverse effects on your health. So that's something you really want to monitor when you're consuming it in its natural form, either through fermented products or through raw ingredients themselves. You're not going to come into any issues with that. It's really about that processed food. So it's about owning your food, understanding it, and really kind of diving into the science of why people get the experience that they have. One thing that I always like to mention with regard to the effects of MSG or glutamate is really when you talk about eating Doritos. If you've ever had a bag of Doritos, I know I have, that powder that they put on it, that cheesy goodness that coats your tongue, that's really what you're getting in terms of a sensation, that coating sensibility and that feeling that you generate through food. So today what I'm going to show you is how we can generate that kind of experience with food, but in a natural way. So we're going to be diving into we're going to be talking about mushrooms, which is one of the more abundant natural ingredients that has umami in it naturally. We're going to be actually making a pan-seared salmon today, which obviously as an animal protein is going to bring a lot of umami to the table. We're also going to be using some soy sauce, some soybeans, and a lot of other elements that are going to come together to generate a huge effect on the mouth and the palate itself, but we're going to do it in a natural way. So first and foremost, what we need to do is we got to get our protein ready to go before we dive into our accompaniments. So what we're doing today is just a simple fillet of salmon. So it's skinned on both sides. So it's really kind of, you know, your basic approach to working with the ingredient. We want to focus more on the taste here than the cooking of the protein, but I'll talk you through that as we move forward. But really, first and foremost, we're going to get our pan going because we want to sear this on a pretty high heat. So that way we can get a nice initial sear on it, try to generate some color there and some caramelization to add a little bit more flavor. But like with anything, first and foremost, we need to season our protein. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of salt and pepper to this. You want to be a little bit minimalist with regard to your seasoning when we talk about fish. Now, salmon can hold up to a lot of things. It's a very strong flavor. It's a very sturdy protein in that sense, but fish is very delicate by nature, so it takes on flavors very easily. So when we talk about seasoning, you want to be very mindful of that element with regard to your seasoning, because it's going to retain it and it's going to pack a really big punch, even if you don't think you're using it a lot. So you really want to be mindful of that when going about seasoning fish as your protein. Okay, so we just got our salt and pepper here, and we're going to add a little bit of vegetable oil to our pan. Not too much, we just want enough to be able to coat the bottom of the pan. Okay. And the reason that we're using vegetable oil in this instance is the fact that we want to have an oil with a high smoke point. Since we're going to be searing this salmon at a really high temperature, we want to have an oil that's going to compete with that and work with it and not actually scorch and start to sour a little bit. So we really want to make sure that we have a nice oil to work with in that regard. Also, it's a neutral flavor, so it's not going to compete in any way with the salmon flavors like an olive oil could or an avocado oil in that instance. You really want to try to have a nice neutral flavor. So our pan's coming up to temperature nicely, and we're going to go into the pan with our skin side down. So in terms of the anatomy of the fish, as you can see, this top half, that rounded edge, is really the internal flesh of the fish. So when we talk about the skin side, that's going to be the flatter end of the fish itself. And the reason we want to start with that is we want to start with our presentation side going into the pan first. And when we're serving fish, we always want to serve skin side up. If the skin's on the fish, you definitely want to serve with that because that's going to have a nice crispiness to it. It's going to add a nice presentation for the customer. But even in terms of when we present it to the customer without any skin on it, we want to go with the skin side down as the presentation side because you're going to get a nice flat initial sear on your fish. So we're going to go ahead and get this into our pan here. You can hear that nice hard sizzle, which is just what we want. And most important thing you can do in this instance is just leave your protein alone. Let the heat cook, let it do its thing, so that way it can start to cook through. We can start to generate a little bit of caramelization potentially on the bottom of the pan with regard to the proteins of the fish. And we can end up with a nice doneness at the end. Ultimately, with your salmon, you want to cook it to about medium rare or so and let it carry over cook. But it's kind of by taster's choice. You really don't need to, you actually cook it to a specific doneness depending on what the customer wants. Some people like it a little bit more underdone than others. Some people like it well done and coffee when it comes out of the pan. So really, in terms of food safety, you want to make sure that you cook it all the way through, but you can have a little bit of the medium rare effect if you really want with regard to your salmon cooking. And one of the nice things with this thickness of fish is that once we get it cooked halfway on one side and onto the other, we get that color that we're looking for. It's going to typically be cooked all the way through. This is a very fast cooking protein, so it doesn't take a lot of time for that start to transition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check our first side here. You can see the cooking's kind of creeping up the side of the pan. Okay. I'm going to check our color here. I'm going to let it go for just a little bit. It's looking really nice. I'm going to adjust our heat just a little bit. That way we don't get too dark of a color on the bottom of our fish. And we're going to continue cooking it onto the other side in just a minute. Now, like I said, you can kind of differentiate on the doneness of how you want it. In most restaurants, they'll ask the customer, how they want it cooked. But in most instances, you're going to want to cook it all the way through. So that way you don't have any of that residual pink, because most people don't like that. But me personally, if I'm having tuna or if I'm having salmon, I like it to be a little bit more on the medium rare side. I'm going to go ahead and flip our protein. You can see we've got some great coloration here. Some nice caramelization, a nice little dense crust for our customer to enjoy, that little contrast of texture. It's exactly what we're looking for. So we're gonna let that continue to cook here. I'm gonna turn up the heat just a little bit. And now what I wanna do is I wanna transition over to kind of what our accompaniment is going to be for this. So as I mentioned before, we're gonna be generating umami and really that taste through a lot of natural ingredients. And so one of the most natural ways that I know of to generate umami is through the use of mushrooms. They're a very meaty vegetable, or fungi, if you will, and they really present a lot of options for students and for people in the industry to gain a lot of flavors and really kind of expand their flavor profiles from that perspective. What I have in front of me is 3 different mushrooms, but they're actually the same mushrooms. So you could use really kind of whatever mushroom you want in this dish. You could use oyster mushrooms if you wanted to. Shiitakes are a very common choice in terms of the ingredients that we're working with today. But what I wanted to go with today was some of the more common mushrooms that you're gonna find in the grocery store on a day in and day out basis, and kind of talk you through you know, kind of the subtleties of them, if you will. I'm gonna quickly check our protein here. Beautiful. I'm going to turn our heat down here. Just let that finish cooking. Perfect. And so what I was mentioning with regard to the mushrooms themselves is that these are actually all the same mushrooms. So every single one of these mushrooms on here, we have our white button, which is the more traditional of the 3 that most people will buy in the grocery store. To my left and your right is going to be cremini mushrooms, or also referred to as baby bella mushrooms. And then over here on my left and your right is our portobello mushrooms. The unique thing about this is that botanically speaking, these are actually all the same mushrooms. So the portobellos actually started out as these same mushrooms, and the baby bellas started out as the same mushroom as well. The only difference between these 3 mushrooms is their age. So they actually will continue to grow and actually develop and darken their flavor, become more earthy and fibrous as they grow larger. So you can see from the coloration of our cremini or our baby bellas that they kind of look like the grown-up parent, the portobello itself, but what they really are is just a further aging process of the white cap mushrooms, and then from the bella up to the portobello, they're just a growth from there on. So you can really see the differentiation of them, but they're actually the exact same mushroom from a botanical nature. So our fish is looking great. It's nice and firm. I'm going to get this off of our heat over here so we can let it rest. So what we're going to do next is we're going to do a quick transition over to the accompaniment for our salmon. We got our beautifully seared salmon here ready and waiting for service. Now we're going to build our garnish, essentially. So again, building on the themes of our umami taste that we're working with today, the main focus is going to be our mushrooms. So I've got some of the portobello mushroom here, sort of julienne, kind of a rough chop on those. We're going to do some fresh garlic, some minced garlic, some aromatics. We're going to add some fresh soybeans, so edamame. If anyone's ever had edamame, one of my favorite foods. It's a great use of protein, and it really generates a lot of umami on the palate as well. We've got some green onion here, some fresh scallion. We're going to add some soy sauce as well, another very high impact umami taste coming from that ingredient, that fermented product of the soy sauce itself. Will really generate a lot of that, also add some nice saltiness flavor to it. And then we're going to add some sesame oil at the very end. In addition to it, over here, what I have is a base for our sauce. So this is actually a orange soy reduction. So what I have over here is really just a combination, equal parts chicken stock and orange juice, freshly squeezed orange juice that I reduced down and then thickened with a slurry, add a little bit of salt and pepper. So this is just gonna be our base that we're going to add to our garnish, which is gonna go along with our salmon, add some nice sweetness elements to our dish and really kind of round everything out in a really nice way. So to get going first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get our vegetable oil into our pan here. Again, continuing with a neutral oil. We don't want any flavors from our oil to impact the taste and the flavor profiles that we're bringing together. And since this is more along the lines of an Asian type of dish, what we really want to avoid is using butter because that's not traditionally used in Asian cookery. So grapeseed oil, peanut oil, vegetable oil, anything like that is typically what you're going to use in terms of working with these types of ingredients. So I'm going to go ahead and get our mushrooms in first. Okay, we're just gonna sweat these out a bit. Now, an important thing to understand about mushrooms is they're really a sponge. So they soak up seasoning, they soak up liquid. They're really just an amazing ingredient to work with because they ultimately take on the flavors that you add to them. So the more love that we give these mushrooms, the better off they're going to taste. Now, using the portobellos, they're going to have a little bit more earthiness to them than if we just use the white caps or the bellas themselves, or the baby bellas, I should say. But in terms of this application, we're going to bring a lot of love to them. We're going to bring a lot of flavor that's really going to work nicely with this dish. So now that we've got that going, I'm going to go ahead and add in our garlic. We want to move fairly quickly with this. That way we have time to team it up with our salmon and have a nice garnish for that to rest on. It's already starting to smell amazing in here. That smells really, really good. I'm going to turn our heat down just a tad. Okay, perfect. Now we're going to go ahead and add in our edamame, which we blanched off ahead of time, just like any green veg. What you want to do with this is you want to cook it in boiling, well-salted boiling water, and you want to make sure that there's a lot of space in the pan, no overcrowding. And then I quickly blanched them once they came out of the water, or in an ice bath, to shock them to kill that cooking process. So that way we lock in that nice green flavor, and we have a really nice tender ingredient to go into our dish. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and add in our soy sauce here. Okay. And I'm also going to go ahead and add in some of our base. A little bit. We're also going to reserve some of that glaze for later on when we go to actually cook or plate our salmon itself. Okay, so we're going to cook this down nicely. Going to turn up my heat just a little bit. Yummy, yummy. So this is the way that we're going to build our plating is this is going to be our base. So there's going to be all those flavors. We've got our soy sauce in there. We've got our aromatics with our garlic and our mushrooms, and then the soybeans, the edamame themselves. And now we're going to add a little bit of our scallions here. We're going to reserve some for our plating later on. Some more aromatics. I'm going to crank our heat here and let this cook down a little bit. I'm going to add some more of the orange sauce to this. This is starting to smell really, really good. I've said this probably 100 times. I really hope that Apple somehow comes up with smell-o-vision in some category of things with their phones, because I wish you all could smell what's going on right now because it smells fantastic. So I'm going to give this a quick taste here. Absolutely perfect. You get that nice saltiness from the soy sauce itself, and then the sweetness, the acidity, and the heartiness of the sauce that we have, that reduction, that orange juice, and that chicken stock. Just really a nice balance of flavors, starting to come down really nicely. What I did with the base itself was, as I said before, I reduced it by half, but I actually thickened it with some slurry, which is also a common thickener for Asian cookery. Main reason that it's the best use for this type of cooking is that it doesn't add any flavors to it, and it kind of remains translucent. So it's not going to impact the color, not going to impact the fat content or anything. It's literally a combination of equal parts cornstarch to water. So key is you bring your liquid up to a boil, you whisk in your starch until you get it to the right temperature, and it actually thickens instantly. So it's a really nice use for making quick pan sauces and things like that when you're working on the line. Okay, so you can see our vegetables have come together nicely. We've got a nice consistency with our soy and our orange reduction here, looking really great. Going to kill our heat here and start to prep our station for plating. So we've got a nice shallow plate here, a nice white plate to present our beautiful food on. Okay. So I'm just going to lay down our garnish. our mushrooms, our edamame, that beautiful reduction as well. Smells really good in here right now. Perfect. Okay. Now I'm going to put on a glove so that I can plate up our salmon, which has been resting beautifully over here. Okay. Rest that right there. We're going to do a quick final drop of the glaze that we have here. Perfect. And then the final touch, a little bit extra scallion here. And there you have it. Beautiful pan-seared salmon with umami as the key feature. Enjoy it.